Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for showing up. It's a little late in the afternoon on this lovely Saturday, so you're probably still in your lunch coma, or maybe you kind of want to go nibble on something. I don't know, just a thought. So thanks for coming. We're going to talk about cloud IAM strategy for multi-cloud and hybrid environments, which is a very long title, but it's going to be a pretty long talk, so buckle up. It's going to be fun. So just for some introductions, I'm Cassandra Young. My handle is muteki. I'm all over the internet. I've done a bunch of different talks all around cloud. I love cloud. It's my favorite thing. I'm currently a senior consultant at CrowdStrike in our services kind of consulting division. I do cloud security assessments, which means I basically get to jump into someone's cloud environment, poke around, find a bunch of holes, and then yell at executives about it, which is really fun. So I used to also be a sysadmin, so I have also suffered alongside you folks as well who are out there as practitioners. And that was my intro to cloud. I also suffered through a master's degree in computer science, which I'm very happy to be done with. 9 of 10 recommend, except for the lack of sleep. And lastly, I'm also a director at Blue Team Village at DEF CON, where I help kind of put on some free content, give trainings and talks for folks that come to DEF CON and stop by the village. So that's me in a nutshell. I am going to hand it over to my wonderful co-speaker, Cosmos, to introduce themselves.
Thank you. My name's Cosmos. I go by Guardian Cosmos. That's my full handle. You could also call me Christian. I go by both. I'm the owner and operator over at Indelible. It's a security company that we founded as a holistic company. I'm also a SANS instructor part-time, and I also do a lot of community advocacy, and I advise a number of different startup companies. Like my counterpart here, I also volunteer at multiple conferences, so you've probably seen my face in a various different shades of hair color, because it's never the same. This is probably the longest I've had a natural hair color in memorable history. So jumping right into it, we like to start all of our talks with some topics and definitions about what we're going to be talking about today, as well as just some baselining definitions here that we think are really important. The first and one probably the most important for this talk, because we're talking about multi-cloud, is defining what is cloud. As you can see by our lovely Morpheus meme over here, it's really just someone else's computer, right? At the end of the day, whenever you're using cloud, you're just outsourcing hosting of that device to someone else. And with it, hopefully, you're outsourcing some of the risk. Now, as we're going to talk about later in this talk, you don't get to outsource all of it, and you have different challenges that you have to overcome instead. We're also going to talk about the differences between traditional, or what we refer to typically as now as on-prem infrastructure, how that interacts in a hybrid environment. That's an environment where you're dealing with both cloud and on-premise devices. We're not going to dive too much into this. We really wanted this to be more of an intro to intermediate talk. We will probably be doing some follow-up talks where we get more in depth on each of our various topics later on. We also, shameless plug, may be releasing a book under No Starch Press in the next couple of years as well on the same topic. We're next going to talk about multi-cloud. So in the context of this talk, multi-cloud is really going to be referring to usage of any of the major cloud providers in concert with another major cloud provider. So in this case, you might be using either Azure, AWS, or GCP, or a combination of all three, or one or two of those. And we'll talk a little bit about the different reasons why you might select each. For example, if you're looking for someone as a cloud provider who's got a little bit of everything, is going to have the most diverse and integrated product set, you're probably going to go to AWS. If you're primarily hosting Kubernetes apps and nothing else, you're probably going to want to go to GCP. And if you are primarily a Microsoft shop, you're probably going to do something with Azure, just because it's going to be the most integrated environment. For the purpose of today's talk, we're also going to talk a lot about identity and access management, as well as identity federation. For the context of this talk, assume that identity and access management is going to be referring to management of the identity and access control systems and the different federation ideas that go along with that. Same thing for federation. How do we handle getting separate, disparate environments to handle the similar set of shared credentials? And what are the best practices around that? Lastly, we're going to try to tie all of these things together, and we'll talk very, very briefly about some automation and orchestration and how to deal with some of these issues as we go through the talk.
Can I get this one on? Thank you. I just realized I'm don't want to just stand here the whole time. So while we're on the topic of definitions, I think we're all kind of familiar with the major three cloud providers. That's going to be AWS, Azure, GCP. They're ranked in order of kind of what their market share is. We have a number of companies that we've worked with that have presence in one or more of these different platforms. And part of the draw for any of these is, well, probably budget. That's probably going to be high on people's list. But folks in AWS tend to be focused more on development. They're hosting workload applications. They were kind of the leader in this space, so they have the widest range of services offerings, worldwide regions that you can deploy applications in. So that's one of the draws for using AWS. It's very developer friendly. I personally like it for writing applications. I use a lot of serverless, microservices, Lambda, things like that, which are more interesting to me than spinning up VMs. So that's my preference. Azure, we see a lot of folks using Entra ID, which is, formerly Azure Active Directory. A show of hands for how many people in this room hate Entra ID as a name. I don't get it, seriously. It's really, really weird. But then a lot of these companies as well, you'll have that M365, your Office 365 email integration. So it has a huge market share, mostly related to that, and also has the ability within Azure itself to host workloads, virtual machines, things like that. So you kind of get that everything's under one roof. It's almost like Microsoft's kind of developing this walled garden that you can use if you stick with Microsoft products. GCP is the wild, wild west, as I like to call it. It's a lot more fun. And it might be also fun to exploit. If there are any red teamers who've ever dealt with GCP, there are some really, really bad defaults. But it's also really fun, really flexible. I personally kind of like that it's a little bit rough around the edges. It's a lot of fun to work with. And it's a great space if you're working with containers, Kubernetes, any of those anything that's going to be more on the serverless side. GCP actually does really well. It's also a lot more budget friendly, so a lot of orgs move to it for that reason. And then I'm going to hand it back over to Cosmos to talk about your own cloud.
All right. So we've talked about all the major commercial cloud providers. Obviously, we didn't name all of the major commercial cloud providers. There are some other clouds out there. NVIDIA has theirs now for a lot of the GPU-intensive workloads, as we've seen the rise of LLMs. Yes, I very specifically chose that terminology. I refuse to use the other one for various reasons. Feel free to ask me about that later. I have a whole rant on it. We're also going to talk about some of the other options available to you. So what if you don't want to side with the major cloud providers? Well, you do have some other options available to you. First of all, you can go with the commercial cloud stack. So all three of the major cloud providers, being GCP, Amazon, and Azure, all offer varying flavors of methods where you can actually virtualize all their services in a hybrid or standalone format on your own devices. So Azure, for example, has Azure HCI. GCP and AWS also have their own proprietary solutions for those. For the purpose of this talk, we're probably going to talk a lot about Azure just because that's already going to be in almost everyone here's environment. Show of hands really quick, how many people have Azure or Office 365 in their environments? Okay, so for the purpose of this talk, we're going to focus a lot around some of the Azure stuff and Entra IDs as your primary source of identity. In later talks, we'll talk a little bit more about using things like Okta or other identity providers. You might be using AWS Cognito for certain things in your applications, but that's a little bit beyond the scope of this particular talk. The other options you have are things like OwnCloud or NextCloud. So these are really great if you're only really looking to commercialize on your existing email and calendar and contact syncing or file syncing. They're not really great for if you want to have a managed SQL server or something like that. So your last option in the category of running your own cloud is actually to use some of these gateway orchestrators. Now, that is not a term you're going to find everywhere. It's just the best term that I found to describe the series of things that you do here. So there are a couple of different utilities. There's a popular one on GitHub right now called PrintTunnel, spelled PRITUNL. Again, it's a little bit too advanced for the scope of this particular talk, but if you want to look it up for extra homework, feel free. It's a solution that's based around a VPN into your walled garden, being your private cloud infrastructure, as well as allowing you to manage via a unified portal like you might be familiar with any of the major cloud platforms, your actual underlying infrastructure. It grants you some user access control. It's not the only one. There are a couple of other good options out there. Feel free to search on GitHub for building your own cloud. You'll find tons of different things. You'll find OpenTofu or Terraform formulas to actually build those environments on some of the existing clouds if you just want to play around with them, or if you happen to have a home lab with a Proxmox server or a VMware array or any of the other virtualization solutions, please do feel free to try that at home as well. It'll work on all of those. So that covers off on gateway orchestrators. I'm going to turn it back over to Cassandra for our next topic.
Thank you very much. And honestly, I hadn't even really looked into the idea of your own cloud and all this stuff before we talked about doing this talk. I'm like, hang on, what is that? And if you don't know what it is, so don't feel bad. It's It's like the next generation thing we're, eventually going to
Much less
all know
common.
about. Yeah, definitely less common. So, I mean, I work in consulting, so I usually work with bigger organizations or some small to medium-sized businesses. And they usually have like a common set of patterns that they follow in terms of their maturity, in terms of their multi-cloud environments. So I pulled some fun statistics. 84% of organizations have a presence in 2 or more cloud platforms. I extrapolated from this based on my own experience and folks I've talked to as well. Probably the most common thing that you can actually see, and I realized that white text on blue background is terrible. I'm going to fix that later. I'll just, side note, we'll be posting the slides on GitHub afterwards, so I'll just tweak that, and then you'll be able to have all this content. You can just download it and fill in the blanks a little bit. So the most common architecture that I personally see in my day-to-day, covering Azure and GCP on the side as well, is my client has an on-premises Active Directory infrastructure. So, users, groups, computer objects, complex OU infrastructure, all that fun stuff. That's Active Directory, and they probably have some other backing systems, workflows to get users kind of provisioned from Workday, for example, into that Active Directory environment. And then they're using something like, I want to say AAD Connect, and I don't think that actually is the term anymore. Forgive me, I usually look at the cloud-only side. And that is going to flow into the very nebulous box that the black arrow points to, which says Entra ID, formerly Azure AD. And you'll see that out from there, we have 3 arrows. So a common kind of setup for an organization would be one of those arrows points up to that first box, which says Azure. So Azure is platform, infrastructure as a service, hosted VMs, cloud storage, managed server instances or SQL Server instances, things like that. That's the platform side. That would flow out from Entra ID and it uses Entra ID as the identity source. The other arrow is going to point to M365, which is kind of like on the other side of that. On the other side of Azure is going to be where M365 is. That's going to be your Office 365. You have SharePoint Online, Teams, which is really honestly just hot dropped on top of SharePoint anyways, but it's a separate service, so I'll call it out. So those are all of your Microsoft hosted services. And then on the other side, you'll see we have AWS. So in this case, a lot of organizations are going to use that Entra ID as an identity source to flow into Amazon Web Services to have that federated integration. So this is a very common example of a multi-cloud organization that is kind of federating everything through Entra ID and behind that Active Directory. So just to briefly, again, I'll be posting a slide, so I'm not going to get too into depth, but there are some really interesting statistics that show a really high increase in the amount of cloud-based intrusions. So 75% increase is pretty significant. This is just 2023. I'm sure it'll be even more this year. There has been an explosion of cloud-savvy threat actors. One example, like on the bottom here, we have 29% of cloud-conscious cases where the intruder knew that they were going into a cloud environment. 29% of those are attributed to Scattered Spider, aka whatever UNC 3944 or Octo Tempest, if you like Microsoft's really weird naming convention. I don't, it's fine. I also work for CrowdStrike, so I might have a slight bias there. But another one, I think it's pretty obvious to say, this 84% cloud-conscious intrusions attributed to e-crime actors. That means they're after money. They're not politically motivated. They're not nation states. And I mean, I don't have any statistics to back this up, but I can look at it and say, if an organization has the kind of money to invest in cloud infrastructure, they might have, a decent amount of money that can be extorted. And that's kind of a common pattern you see in these intrusions. So when we look at the threat landscape, when we look at what's actually occurring in these intrusions, kind of one common theme that we see is that they're really primarily going to be from exploiting valid credentials. So your social engineering attacks, your leaked credentials, your lack of MFA. You should all have MFA. Please, my God, please. And so some of these vectors are going to include phishing, stolen compromised credentials, business email compromise, also a big contributor. And that section alone probably adds up to I can do math, 40% of compromises. And I call out cloud, like these cloud misconfigurations at 11%, that's actually lower than you might expect. Like the cloud is not insecure by default. It's insecure because humans go in and like make things easier for themselves. I think we can all agree with that. And then malicious insider at 6%, I think contributes too, because when you have IAM like designed in a way that has excess credentials and excess privilege, you can kind of, if you get someone smart enough, they can go in and find out a lot about the environment just using all the access that they might have that that the user doesn't actually need. So I would almost say that insider really is a kind of an important thing to think about, not just because of the people behind the attack, but what they can do once they're in the environment. And then it's also worth noting that IAM and the ability to privilege escalate extends the lifetime of an attack. So that's kind of an important factor too. And then the last thing I'll say about this particular topic is multi-cloud adds complexity. Shocking, right? Completely shocking. Like multiple clouds? Clouds complicated? Multiple clouds? Yeah, I know, pretty obvious. But I think it's kind of interesting. I was looking for some more like hardcore statistics around this. I didn't have an easy time with that, but I think seeing that like the average time to identify and contain data breach is a little bit higher for these use of multiple environments. I think that makes sense intuitively. Cost of breaches is also higher. I think that again correlates pretty well. So I think it's worth saying that when you take the combination of presence in multiple clouds and identity and access management, you've got the perfect kind of boiling pot of stew for something going completely wrong if you don't have the right controls in place. So, yeah. So now we're going to get into it. And I'll just say, we've got, there are gaps and then there are recommendations around all of these strategic recommendations or strategic kind of angles on these different topics. So decentralized identity source of truth, that really does not flow as a sentence. I don't know where my brain was at when I was saying that. But it's, I'll go into a client environment and oftentimes what I'll wind up seeing is they might have something where they have like Active Directory, Entra ID, Azure, and it's like, it's pretty clean, it's documented, maybe not completely accurately, but there was an attempt. And then on the side, they've got like GCP and Google Workspace, and it's like nothing but ad hoc users. Like they don't know half of who's in it, they have no idea why that person's a super admin. Wait, that one doesn't even work here anymore? It's not a good look, guys. It's really not. So that kind of comes up as a huge strategic gap when we have these conversations. Accounts manually provisioned. Like you're also asking users to, if they're, you're not federating individual users. You're asking people to have to memorize another set of credentials, and like they can't even get MFA right. Like you really expect them to memorize passwords? I don't think so. And then we have some, inconsistent application of privileges. Again, why is this person super admin? They don't even work here anymore. Why is insights going to a Gmail address? I have no idea. So, recommendations around that are like, basically sit down and actually architect what this should look like. And I can't really tell you there's one exact way to do it. There just isn't. It's not going to ever work like that. But having a process of figuring out, like, what are your edge cases, what kind of users you have, what other service principles, are in the environment that should be probably cloud only, like, having these discussions at a high level before you get too deep in the weeds of implementation and aren't able to actually, roll it back if it's not done in a way that's making sense for your organization. Defining and documenting everything. I almost put that on every single line because it is so important. Like when I have conversations with organizations, it's like, do you have a defined process for how you provision users? Usually they do. Sometimes they don't. But like, is the documentation accurate? A little wiggle room there. And the same thing with privileges. We want to make sure that you're defining what users need what permissions. Which admins really need global admin and Entra ID? Hint, hint, pretty much none of them. And then lastly, ensure that your security controls are baked into the processes for provisioning. Next, I just want to call out service accounts synced from on-prem. You almost never need to do this. You really don't. And I see it pretty much constantly. There are very few use cases for this. So while you're architecting around, wanting your users to come from a centralized identity source and flow into the environment, you don't need every single user you should actually limit what accounts get synced over, what devices get synced over, and really kind of like map that out, what that's supposed to look like based on what you're actually using. Oops. And then some edge cases, you've got like contractors, role changes. I asked the question of organizations like, tell me about what happens when you provision a user. Someone starts, they're gonna be a dev or something like that. They get onboarded in Workday, there's a couple processes, a ServiceNow ticket gets generated, they get put into an Active Directory group, that group syncs to Entra ID, blah, 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 blah. They get provisioned into Azure. Great, they get some roles assigned. They leave the company. And they're like, the companies usually say, well, the account gets deactivated in Workday and the whole process works backwards. What happens when someone changes roles? Does anyone here think that their org might have a little bit of a gap in that? Yeah, I see some enthusiastic nodding. This is almost always like the pause in the conversation when it comes up. Because, if you have a dev working on one project and they get moved to another project, if you don't have a clear process for how that privilege moves, then they might wind up being overprivileged if they just get manually granted additional roles instead of their existing roles being re-evaluated. So you kind of always want to look out for those edge cases. So enforcing your cloud-only service accounts with as much as possible, defining and documenting, yet again, I'll say it a million times, your processes for contractors, you can align them with your normal users if possible. If not, create a standard process that encapsulates their needs. And then implementing regular entitlement reviews, that'll help with the kind of role changes and other odd edges, reevaluating permissions, things like that. And then weeding out stale or unnecessary privileged accounts using tooling and entitlement reviews. We'll hold for questions at the end. And we're actually going to have a little more discussion too, hopefully, if I don't talk too long. Yeah, I'm like, oh, look at the time. So just another quick thing to call out. I see a lot of cases of not really enough logging and monitoring. This one's always going to be tough. Who here is concerned about the volume of logs in your cloud environment? Yeah, it is not cheap. So there are strategies to work through that. So some of them would include, pre-filtering. A lot of cloud environments will have, stream logs to either like a pub sub thing in GCP or other technology, and you can basically filter out the ones that you actually need and just export those, because those costs are going to hit you on the export from the environment. So there are some ways around that, but logging and monitoring and actually customizing your alerts, because that's another thing that we don't really see enough of, will help you kind of catch any abnormal behavior or egregiously obvious intrusions a little bit earlier. So we definitely see that as a kind of a common thing that comes up. Yeah, and I think we just have, there's never going to be enough visibility into misconfigured IAM permissions. And that's something where I can't really advise people because I don't know exactly what the use case is. So you have to kind of take a little extra time to really evaluate that. And I mean, honestly, I would say, use tools that exist out there. Like CSPMs are really, great at having some, even out of the box capabilities to look at the roles that you have assigned and say this is very privileged. Does it really need to be this privileged? So make that cloud security a joint effort between existing tools and cloud native capabilities. And then one last thing I'll call out, I think, before I'm going to hand it back over. Or maybe not, I don't know. Have I got one more there? Yeah, keep charging along. Particularly about this. So I think that one of the main issues I see is when talking to organizations, they still have this on-prem mentality. The amount of times I've heard lift and shift. I hate that term so much. It makes my skin crawl. It's really bad. But there's kind of this mentality of well, we have this way that we do things, and now we're just using a different technology to do the same thing. If you get stuck in that mentality, it's really hard to adapt to the unique challenges that cloud is going to throw your way. And even worse, if you're in a multi-cloud environment where you just have this excessive complexity that, and each cloud has its own unique issues and its own quirks. So it's really difficult to bring an on-prem mentality to something that is just so completely incompatible. Human knowledge, yeah, it's incredibly difficult to get cloud resources, to get people that really know cloud. And then you find for one cloud, well, technically, sometimes those skills are transferable. I like to think that they are on a conceptual level, but when it comes down to implementation, they're very different. Yeah, and then, just documented processes, having cloud-specific processes is often an issue as well. And did you have anything you wanted to add that I haven't covered?
No, I think you did a really good job. You covered most everything. Just for people who are wondering, we do have a reference on the slide to where all the statistics came from, but if you are interested in those statistics, you can find those in a combination of the CrowdStrike Threat Report as well as the Ponemon Institute report, which is the cost of a data breach report. It's put out every year in conjunction with IBM and their red team.
Yeah, there's some really awesome reports that I was like, I'm reading this report and I actually like it. This is weird.
Wait, a report that's not fluff? What?
Shocking. And then, please, I love diagrams, so brownie points for thorough, up-to-date diagrams. Please give me all your diagrams. So, before we move into the next section, I really had to put a little Bernie Sanders in there.
We had to ask you at least one more time,
At least one more time. All right, I will hand it back over.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I will. So we did mention that this is a more intro, intermediate level talk. So although this is a more technical session of this talk, it's not going to go as deep as some of you may expect. We're not going to go through any examples today. We will try to post some of those later on. Along with the talk slides. So the first thing you got to do is pick your poison. So how many people here, by show of hands, would prefer to do role-based provisioning with groups? How many of you would prefer to do it with RBAC and direct role assignments? Less of you. Okay. So there's a really good reason why there's a difference in that dichotomy. And I'm not going to say that any one group is right or one group is wrong because you're both right. So there are advantages and disadvantages from both approaches. With group-based provisioning, I generally like to advise customers that if you are having a group of consistent, and when I say consistent, I mean always reliably consistent, i.e. I have a tier 1 help desk person. They always get the same exact roles. That's a really good use case if you have a large team to use a group for your access provisioning. If it's less than 10 people, that role is probably a privileged role, or it's a role that's less commonly used or more specific to a particular work stream, you may be better off using a direct assignment with role-based provisioning. Why? In terms of management at scale, you run less of a risk of, one, confusing the group or reusing the group, and two, especially in modern identity providers, which have abandoned the hierarchy, so to speak, that many people were used to with OUs and DUs inside of classic on-premise Active Directory, those concepts don't really translate well to identity providers based on cloud systems. For example, the stack for your directory inside of Entra ID is actually much flatter in nature than, even though you can nest groups, it's still flatter and it's not hierarchical. Right? So there's a big difference there, and that can impact the way that you want to provision roles and lead to things like over-provisioning, which we'll talk a little bit more about on some of the extra slides. The other reason that you might want to use role-based provisioning over group-based provisioning is it definitely is more granular. Like I said, if you're using a privileged role or depending on what identity provider and cloud combination you're using, there are various advantages. Great example, as I mentioned, we're going to talk a lot about Azure and Entra because that's what most people in this room are probably using as their primary identity source. In Entra, we now have the ability to provision roles in Azure to specific resources from within our identity portal inside of the Entra portal, right? So not only can I provision administrative roles for Office 365 administration, but we can now start to provision things in Azure. And that uniformity removes a lot of ambiguity that you have with other identity providers when it comes to things like assessing claims. So whether or not you get a token in a OAuth or a SAML type response, you are always going to have some form of claims that tells you what roles and groups you have. Now, there's some downfalls to that. One being if you have a very large organization and you have users that have a lot of claims, you may run out of space, and you may have to combine some of those claims. You also may need to transform some of those on the fly in your requests for compatibility with various systems. So there are reasons why you might go both directions. And your biggest choice is really going to come down to what cloud am I using and what identity providers am I using, and what is going to be my ultimate source of truth. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, a great choice for RBAC is your global admins. Please do not provision those by group, and please don't provision more than 5. It's bad. Don't do it. Also, please don't give service principals global admin.
And also, in addition to that, if you have money, and you know who you are when you have money, Please, please use privileged identity access management controls and PAM solutions, especially for your admins. And also make sure that all your admins are named. Please do not share admin accounts unless you have another method of tracking them. I cannot tell you the number of breaches that we've both encountered in our roles where there is just an account and we can't figure out who did what when on it because there was no attribution ability. So let's talk about some of the inconsistencies that tend to exist when you are doing provisioning and assignments. Inconsistency is a big problem. Why? Depending on what cloud providers you're using in a multi-cloud scenario, right, the role and the permissions granted by each role are going to vary. They're not always the same. What is true for AWS may not be true for Azure or GCP and vice versa. Now, there are a couple of roles that do match that and are the same across all platforms, but some of them don't exist. A really good example of that, we mentioned earlier, one of the best use cases to use GCP for is if you're looking for an auto-scaling Kubernetes cluster. They have a service called Autopilot. It is much more cost-effective than using, say, ECS or EKS on AWS, where you're provisioning a pool of traditional VMs as opposed to a auto-scaling array, where you're only paying for what you're using instead of paying a fixed price for your pool size, right? So that's a really good example. So if you have an Autopilot administrator role on GCP, that role will never exist in AWS. It will never exist in Azure. There isn't a comparable, compatible technology on those platforms. So how do we deal with that? In many cases, people don't. So instead of using a single source of truth being your IDP of choice, right, many people will choose to actually manage and provision each of these accounts and roles individually across each of their clouds and identity providers. This leads to our inconsistency problem here. Because you can't map it up, it's hard to find one single list, you lack visibility. I'm gonna use the buzzword that everyone hates, so cross it off on your bingo card. You know, single pane of glass, that doesn't exist. In fact, up until recently being defined as the last year, AWS had no way for you to view all resources across all regions. They only introduced the global dashboard last year. Now, I just want you to think about the fact that it is 2024. They introduced this in 2023. How long has AWS been around, right? And a huge problem that we see in cloud as a form of attack vector is if I compromise a cloud account for you, what do I have access to? Everything. I have a whole cloud environment. I don't need to leverage and hide in your existing resource when I can spin up any resource of my choosing. And the only way anyone's going to notice is when the bill changes. And if I'm really clever and I use containers and I use the always free tiers, you are never going to find those assets. Why? You probably don't have a good asset report for your cloud. You know, I'm just going to ignore the fact that you probably don't have one for on-prem either, for the sake of this talk at least. So we've talked about inconsistency in terminology. We've talked about inconsistency in technical application. We also got to talk about the role and functions of scope. As I mentioned it in my Autopilot example, right? Your scope of what permissions are granted and what those permissions can do is going to vary between your different clouds. Do you want to add anything on there?
Just 100% accurate.
So now that we've talked about some of those challenges, let's talk about the big bear in the room. How many of you have had to deal with federation? Yay. I hear the yays, the sighs, and I can tell you how many of you are actual practitioners who have used the cloud based on how many groans I heard and where I heard them from. So when you're doing federation, federation is the idea that I'm going to take one set of identity from one service set, and I'm going to try to reuse that in some fashion on another parallel set of items. Now, the problem is these are not the same controls. So during the process of federation, in many cases, you're going to use some kind of transformer. A transformer is essentially an on-the-fly method to say, you are a member of this group, which translates to this group over here. It's basically just a big case statement, right? Many times that'll be governed by your IDP, and in some cases, it'll be governed by the product that you're integrating with because it'll be a part of the role mapping. So that leads to a lot of very interesting complications in federation. For one, going back to our prior slide, inconsistencies in naming conventions, in scopes of permissions lead to a lot of federation problems. Because if I am a person who's trained specifically on AWS, and I walk into a GCP shop and I think that I'm going to use the same set of accounts and roles to grant that access, I am in for a rude awakening because it's not going to match up. There's a couple other problems here as well. Collisions. What happens when there's a name collision? What happens when there's a reserved name? There are a number of reserved names, not many of which are actually published. So the only way that you'll find out that you have a collision problem with your role claims is one of two things will happen. Something will break, or you'll get popped because it's overly broad. In a very, very rare third case, you may get an error message, but unfortunately, if you are fortunate enough to get said error message, you're probably not going to understand what it means. We also have a problem with over-provisioning. What happens when an account has a different footprint on each different service? Again, let's say I have a very large AWS footprint, but a very small Azure footprint. I may find that the group that I'm using to provision that set of roles does not make sense to use on Azure because those roles will never be used. So now I've over-provisioned access for an account that'll never be used. The other problem is what happens if I federate an entire identity directory. Is Joe Schmo in accounting ever going to log into an EC2 instance? Probably not. If he does, there's something wrong, right? Maybe like an AVD streaming workspace app or other virtual desktop, but definitely not just SSHing into a Linux EC2 box. I think that's probably beyond most anyone in many accounting departments. Apologies if I have accountants in the room. So we have over-provisioning, right? I've now created a stub account via federation for users that will never log into that cloud provider. So that comes back to trimming down how you federate your data and making sure that you're only federating accounts that will actually be actively used. It also creates a lot of noise when you're trying to do incident response, attribution, or detection because you have so many accounts to now sort through that are inactive that it's hard to figure out what might make sense or what might be relevant for your active use case. We also have over-abstraction. So over-abstraction is a proxy of trying to solve some of the other problems on the slide, right? So let's say, and again, it's a little beyond the scope to get into the details of using a orchestrator platform like Terraform or OpenTofu. Also, feel free to come talk to me about the difference between the two later on. I have a whole other slide deck just for that. But that also leads to some visibility issues, right? So visibility, go back to my EC2 dashboard instance, right? Now, if I have that much trouble with assets in a singular cloud provider, what happens when now I have a single cloud provider, and then I have a second cloud provider, and then maybe a third cloud provider, I've got a directory provider, I've got an IDP, and I've also got my on-prem. Am I ever going to have a clear asset inventory? Probably not. Can I get close? Maybe. How do we solve the visibility issue? We're going to talk more about that. So we've talked about some of the technical gaps. We've talked about the provisioning. So let's talk a little bit more about RBAC. RBAC is hard. RBAC plus least privilege on disparate systems, it's harder, right? Why? Why is it hard? Well, we talked about a number of the issues, right? We have different roles across different platforms. They have different names. They have different scopes. They have different claims. They have visibility issues. It's hard to have a single source of truth, right? So one of the best things you can do is pick a single source of truth for identity. If you're an Azure shop, in an Office 365 shop, it's probably Entra ID. If you are using Okta, it might be Okta, right? And from there, you can then decide, do I have a big enough use case on my multi-cloud environment to manage that particular very, very small scope? Again, going back to the Kubernetes example, if I'm using GCP and the only thing I use it for is autopilot in a Kubernetes cluster, I might be able to manage the roles locally without requirement for federation in just GCP because that team is very strictly scoped and no one else should ever go in there. And I can set up an alerting rule to detect that someone that's not on the authorized team tried to use that access, right? And then I can triage that appropriately. So that's starting to get into the how do we solve. So we start with abstraction layers. We start with normalization. We consolidate dashboards. We, for lack of a better term, we get a CSPM, right? We need to do some cloud security posture management. That'll help us with managing our configurations. That'll help us with consistency across different providers. And it allows us to create uniformity. And you might say to me, I can't afford a CSPM. I bet you can. There's so many great free ones. We're going to get to some on the last slide. We have a resource slide where I've listed a couple links to a couple. WASA, which is a great implementation of OSEC for HIDs and NIDs, if you're not familiar with it, has recently added some cloud provision capabilities. And there's also a new tool that's being co-sponsored by OWASP that'll be released as an open source CSPM this year at Black Hat. So it's another great thing to follow. Full disclosure, I'm not involved with that project. I just know about it. And if you Google that, you will find some of the initial slide decks already available online. So the other thing we can do is we can create common lexicons and custom roles. Now, custom roles are scary, right? Custom roles mean that I'm going to develop a role, I'm going to give it my own naming convention, and I'm going to assign a series of permissions to it. And it's a lot of work, and a lot of people tend to do it wrong. But if you do it right once, it'll solve a lot of problems going forward. And again, going back to something Muteki said earlier, documentation. Please document your stuff.
You
And make
define
sure
processes for everything. You define the process, please.
and make sure that you are going to use that and that it matches reality. Please do not be one of those orgs that writes some beautiful documentation, and then I look at your org chart and nothing makes sense. It doesn't add up. If something changes in prod, make sure you change it in your documentation. We're looking at you, every one of the major cloud providers out there right now whose documentations are all wrong. And lastly, as I mentioned, create additional tooling. So when it comes to this, right, to put it bluntly, if you want to take the honors there.
Design and document, please. Design and document your implementation thoroughly and accurately.
If you take nothing from this talk, walk away with better documentation, please. It'll save you and every consultant you ever hire a lot of headache and a lot of work, and it'll save your org a lot of money. So to close out, we did want to put a couple of resources up here, and we did want to leave a couple minutes at the end for any questions that you guys might have. So I'm going to go very quickly over the resources on this slide, what each of them is. Again, we will be making this available later on Muteki's GitHub, so please feel free to go ahead and look for that later. So the first thing we have on our tool list over there, pick your strain. Depending on who your AV provider or identity provider of choice is, you may have access included in your existing subscriptions to a commercial CSPM. For example, if you are a CrowdStrike customer, you have access to Horizon. If you are an Azure customer and an Office 365 customer and you have an E5 license, you have access to Cloud Defender, which does a hell of a lot for you. And Defender, for those of you who have been in the AV game for a very long time, you will remember the days where Defender had really bad rule sets that were very not useful. That's not the case anymore. They've gotten a lot better over the years. Now, you might look at open source tools, things like Prowler, Scout Suite, CloudSploit, and Scuba Gear. These are all some really good open source utilities. You can find all of those on GitHub and use them for free to assess your accounts today. Each of them has a different format of reporting. Prowler and Scout Suite are probably, I would say, and feel free to chime in, probably the top two that we see used most often and get the best results from. They also do have some advantages. Both Prowler and Scout Suite will let you write your own custom checks and rules, so you can uniqueify that to your organization. And then in terms of orchestration, OpenTofu and Terraform. I will be really brief because we are running out of time here, and I can talk about the difference between those two for a very long time. The most important thing to know is OpenTofu and Terraform are the same thing. HashiCorp just decided to be not very nice and change their business license agreement for using Terraform. So some very nice people decided that they were going to fork the last open source version, very similar to the Elasticsearch debacle. And created OpenTofu. So they are intercompatible. OpenTofu as a project has committed to making sure it remains compatible with Terraform for the foreseeable future. You can move any of your existing plans over without an issue. But OpenTofu is now sponsored by the Apache and Linux Foundations. So they are committed to remaining permanently free and open source under a consumer-friendly license. In terms of some links that we have over here, we do have some links to some cloud utility repos. Awesome CloudSec Labs will give you a lot of different labs and some plans to deploy those labs if you want to play around with cloud. We also have the CS Suite up there. We have a link to the Prowler GitHub repository, and we also have a link to the Awesome Cloud Native repository. Again, it's another great resource with a bunch of different cloud resources included there. And lastly, we do have our reports there. I have a link to WASA. I have a mention of Magpie. We don't have a link for that yet because it's not live until Black Hat this year. So definitely keep an eye out for that. And last but not least, we have the 2 links to the reports that we've used. So with that, I'm going to turn it over back to Muteki, and we can answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Yeah, absolutely. I personally don't like Scout Suite. I think their little interface you have to load that's not programmatic is not that great, but I am a huge supporter of Prowler. I love it. So I think we had some discussion points we wanted to talk through, but I think we only have about 5 minutes-ish, so I just want to go ahead and just take some general questions. I think you had one earlier. So go ahead. It's better than not touching it at all.
Well, yeah, no, but is there still a better way to do it, or is that good enough? Naive?
I think it probably has something to do with
It depends a lot. It depends on who your cloud provider is, what level of orchestration you're using, and who your identity access provider is. and what the skill set of your team is. In some cases, if you've got a lower skill set team and you've had some consultants come in and orchestrate everything for you, you may find it easier to just deprovision and reprovision, but that's not always the best because that can have some very vicious side effects depending on any other automations or processes that are around. It could also be time consuming and impact, work time and consistency in that transition. In the back?
Wait, way over there. Yep, you. For anyone that didn't hear that, so if there's a Workday integration, then having a Workday change trigger the process to actually reevaluate permissions or to reassign them. That's a good workaround for that. I think it really depends, like, how much integration do you have? Is it going to get to the point where it hits, like, the identity provider, but it doesn't, like, reprovision once it passes from, like, Active Directory over AD Connect to Entra, then into Azure, for example? So it's really a matter of, like, how technically mature your organization is and how, like, locked down those processes are. But yeah, I'd be worried about, like, if you have enough integration where, like, you deprovision, reprovision a user, like, is there something else in the chain that might, like, get a little messed up there? Over here, yep. Thank you. Documentation in the room. Give it up.
Documentation for the win every time. Living documentation, documentation of code, recipes. My favorite thing ever, entitlements management and recipes. Please use them. Infrastructure of code is one of the best ways to make sure your documentation always stays up to date anytime you make a change. So one of the more complex use cases that we were actually talking about last night is when you leverage something like an orchestration platform. And then fine-grain that based on the different resources you want to provision into. So for example, using either Terraform or Tofu example, I might define a resources file that just defines all of my users and how my users are going to be loaded in from an existing database connection or a spreadsheet, which will have a different field, which will flag, what provisioning should happen. That in turn can also be used to generate live documentation, either a Notion page, a Confluence page, if you like Monday and Monday Docs. I mean, there are integrations for all these tools. You can do that as part of your change control. So if you have automations in Jira or if you're using Git-based workflows in GitHub, you have lots of options with workers to help automate that. And that's why I say, infrastructure as code is your friend because that's going to help take a lot of that burden away from you. And it also can address some of the provisioning issues we were talking about because if you're using entitlements management, you can use that to manually trigger, automatically trigger periodic access reviews that'll be performed by managers based on how you have done the organizational chart inside of your identity provider.
And just to walk it back, like take it a little bit more abstract from the strategic perspective or like looking at it from a process perspective, like, putting a lot more thought into like designing how roles are supposed to look, like what these processes look like, and taking time to actually like socialize that process between your disparate teams. It's always a question of like, how closely does the security team work with the cloud team? Is it like a war every time they want to do some kind of change? Well, the more process and strategy you incorporate early on in that life cycle, then the easier it is to make small changes and to actually have them be properly implemented. And like that would tie in really well to having like, let's design how these roles are supposed to look, and then we're going to write Terraform code or OpenTofu code to actually like create them for us, and then they'll kind of be there, and that'll ease everyone's job. I think I can take like one last question real quick. Anyone else? Over there.
That's a really good question. Right now, honestly, if you're dealing with blockchain because of the CPU intensity that you're looking for, your best bet is probably to look at either making your own with your own infrastructure. So again, a little beyond the scope of this talk, getting into that one slide we had where we talked about building your own cloud and your own orchestration layers. That's definitely one option if you want to run your own data centers, or if you're okay to use your own orchestration portal and you just want that higher level of automation and control and customizability for your own users. You may write something or adapt something open source custom in-house to manage the resources existing on another cloud. Alternatively, you may explore other more GovCloud friendly options that might be better for that. But specific to blockchain, you're probably going to want to try NVIDIA's new cloud offering today because they just have the most access to their own GPUs at the better rates. So particular to blockchain, if you're looking to build your own private walled garden, that's probably one of your best spots to look outside of building your own data center. All right. Well, thank you all.
Thank you very much. So as mentioned, slides will be up on my GitHub probably within the next couple days. So check it out. I'm on the Twitter. I refuse to call it X, just like Entra ID. It's a terrible name. And then we're both on LinkedIn on the various medias and all that fun stuff. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Stay tuned. We'll be releasing additional follow-up talks and books at later conferences.